Judith Sloan, welcome to this conversation where we'll just have a bit of a chat about your chapter to the book Dignity and Prosperity. So thank you very much for your contribution and to the book itself. In particular, you start your chapter with, I think, a well-deserved acknowledgement of the late, great Peter Reith. And perhaps before we move on to some questions, I thought it might give you the opportunity to just say a few words, because both you and I knew Peter personally, and I think he was one of the great liberals, reformers, particularly in the industrial relations space that this country's ever seen. So perhaps if you'd like to say a couple of words about your interactions with Peter and why you think he deserved to be acknowledged in the book.
Well, I make the point, David, in my chapter actually, that had Peter Reith been in a position to write the chapter, it should have been him and not me. But I feel as though in some ways I was channeling him. He and I were great friends for a long period of time. But, and I acknowledge John Howard here, but both Peter Reith and John Howard understood the importance of industrial relations, particularly from the small business perspective. So if you think about Peter Reith, he did law, but then basically became a country solicitor down on Phillip Island, and then actually was very important in establishing a multi-faith independent school down there.
True.
And I think those early experiences really informed him in terms of the importance of, regulatory barriers, the rigidities of the system in terms of establishing businesses and establishing organisations. So I think that was important to him. I guess we need to acknowledge to a degree Paul Keating here, because in the early 90s he did begin the process of breaking away from the quite rigid system of centralised arbitration. And that was a very brave thing to do, because it wasn't clear that the trade unions really embraced that idea. So he introduced a limited form of enterprise bargaining. But it was really Peter Reith and his legislation which opened up enterprise bargaining to non-union settings, and also brought in some quite strong deregulatory measures to take us away from that ossified arrangement. So I think he was absolutely critical. And if you kind of try and look at it in retrospect after probably the disastrous political development of work choices, Peter Reith understood the importance of getting the balance right and taking the electorate along with him and his government.
Well, we'll come back in a moment to talk a little bit more about the IR reforms that you proposed in the chapter and some of those issues. But you're an economist, you've been a company director, you're a columnist, regular columnist in the Australian and the Spectator. And over the years, I guess you would have seen a lot of changes in the economy, in companies, being responsible as a company director, and obviously commentating on these developments. So of those three areas of expertise, where do you think the big changes have been since, for instance, say, the end of the Howard era for the last 15, 16 years in Australia? What would you say have been the most fundamental changes that you've witnessed?
Well, of course, the most fundamental change going further back was basically the opening up of the economy and deregulating the economy more generally. So removing the high tariff barriers, allowing deregulation of the financial system, introducing some competition into government enterprises, and of course the privatisation process more generally, absolutely critical. I think actually since the end of the Howard era, the changes have been more incremental and not entirely positive, right? So it's gone in fits and starts, but we've basically seen a rapid growth in what we'd call the non-market economy. So government services, often contracted out, not necessarily directly provided by government. That has been a sort of huge issue, and I don't think a particularly helpful one to industrial relations, because they often are regulated in strange ways. So I think my feeling is that if you think about maybe the last 15 to 20 years, for small businesses in particular, life has become harder, not easier. And so that, I think, is one of the current challenges for the government. I mean, one of the central propositions I make in my chapter is that the Liberal Party needs to retake this issue.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely.
This is an issue which has, I think, very strong electoral appeal, particularly in outer suburban and regional areas. And I think, sadly, to a fair degree, they had vacated that field. I mean, it is worth thinking about, for example, John Howard's abiding interest in this topic was partly stemmed from the fact that he saw his father basically commercially damaged by quite arbitrary regulatory changes. So I just think this is a very fertile field for the Liberal Party to get re-involved in.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a bit of a shame that the Liberals felt so spooked after 2007 and wouldn't touch the subject at all. And in fact, what we've seen clearly is the Labor Party has a very big interest because of their union paymasters, and they take every opportunity, including at the moment, to not only make the labour market more rigid, but also to dramatically increase wherever they can union control and interference in the whole market, including roping in people who've chosen not to be part of the formal IR system. They now want to pull them all in as well across the board. And if we think about that, you mentioned opening up the economy, and in many ways, IR is our centralised wage fixing system, is the last bastion of the original Federation closed economy. It goes all the way back. And we managed to finally overcome through the 60s and then through the 80s the other two bastions, which was the restrictive immigration policies followed by the high tariff barriers. And yet we've still stuck with what is not all that dissimilar to the original Federation construct. And I just wondered, do you think we can overcome that inefficient, outdated legacy? And without going into some of the specifics, do you think that should be one of our objectives, if not immediately, in the longer term, to make the Australian economy a genuinely modern, open, competitive, efficient, productive economy?
So here's the thing. I think it's very important for the Liberal Party to fully embrace the idea of freedom of association. So I think philosophically, but also politically, it's important not to oppose unions. It's fine to object to some of their behaviour, but the idea that employees should be free to associate and form groups that represent their interests, that is something that the Liberal Party needs to strongly endorse. But let's bear in mind here that only about 15% of the workforce actually are members of the union now. So you talk about opening up the economy. At that time, 50 to 60% of the workforce belonged to unions. So it's a very, very different world. And if you think about the 15% odd who belong to unions now, if you take out teachers and nurses, it's really very small. And so in the private sector, for example, it's considerably less than 10% of workers. So it seems to me that, yes, fully endorse freedom of association, support the legitimate role of unions, and although not the monopoly unions we've got, it would be much better to have a sort of competitive model there. But then to say, well, we need to cater for the very large sector of the economy that is not unionised, and we need to have rules in place that are very neutral in respect of union and non-union settings.
Yeah. It seems to me that as we've sought to re-regulate the labour market since 2007, and bear in mind we got through the GFC under the work choices framework, so Labor's new more rigid IR system didn't come into effect until after we got through
right.
the flexible period that I think was important for the GFC.
Yes,
which
yes,
people
and
do
the-
forget
and then-
that point. Fair
Yeah.
Work came in after the GFC had passed, and we managed to get through that. And maybe it wouldn't have been so easy if we had such rigid rules as Fair Work Australia. Since then, we've also seen, and it's a longer term trend, but I think it's become more exacerbated, a real suppression in real wages and falling productivity. Of course, the last figures were disastrous. We've got productivity that we've not seen for decades, and it's going backwards, not improving at all. And I just wonder, from your perspective, both as an economist and working in companies and also commentating on it more broadly, how strong do you think the link is between the lack of flexibility in the labour market and the poor outcomes we see on productivity and wage growth?
So, well, on your first point, it's a very good point, because Gillard, I'm not sure Prime Minister Gillard, or as she was at the time a minister, fully realised what she allowed. So they allowed the work choices agreements to run on until their end point. And so, as you say, at the time of the GFC, many of those work choice agreements were still in place, and they were extremely flexible. I'm sure that's a kind of narrative that the Labor Party would rather suppress. Look, I think the thing is, you've got to be a little careful in the analysis that what happened during the 2010s was that we had extremely low inflation, and so it's what economists call money illusion. So wages were going up slowly. Productivity was also actually going up, but going up slowly. And so you were getting real wage gains in the vicinity of between about 0.8 and 1% a year, which actually might be quite good, because you can have high inflation and high wages and you still are only going to get 0.8 or 1%. So it was a sort of a plodding period, I would say. And don't forget, unemployment was not as low as it is now, so that was probably suppressing wages to a degree too. But basically, I think what was happening was that workers were continuing to withdraw from unions. The unions didn't quite know, they were keen on enterprise bargaining, but they had supported all these restrictions on enterprise bargaining. And so what essentially happened was that the number of enterprise agreements collapsed and the coverage of those agreements collapsed, in part because, sort of ironically, they imposed these very rigid regulations surrounding enterprise agreement making. And, so from my perspective of companies, they tended to withdraw. Now, in some ways, I think it was kind of quite an interesting period, because what companies tended to do instead was to, which I think is a very liberal idea, was to treat workers individually. And so what flourished were individual arrangements. Now, they were subject to the award base, and of course for big companies that's no big deal. For smaller companies that's a bigger deal. But basically you got a lot of arrangements where individual performance was rewarded, and I don't think that was entirely a bad thing. It's not what the Labor Party had in mind, I might add, but that's what happened.
Sure. So people were moving out of the more formalised restrictive system
absolutely.
by choice, voting their feet, and we've seen that. And I wonder on that point, if you look at the rigidity that we have in the system, but the other part I think that comes with that is the complexity. And in your chapter, you highlight this, the absolute complexity of the award system, on top of the minimum standards that we have, on top of having to deal with all sorts of other particular arrangements. One might be trying to agree with subcontractors, employment on the side. And you say that, in your chapter, and we know it's come up, that even the biggest companies in Australia who have vast human resources departments, vast legal teams, have trouble complying with these rules. And if they can't comply, you have to wonder how any small business, family business, could possibly be expected to comply with it. And therefore I put to you, and you discussed it a little bit in your chapter, how can we make it easier, as well as more flexible, but easier for particularly the small business sector, which we know is the dynamic sector of the economy, of enterprise and entrepreneurship. How can we have a system that allows them to, within the law, grow their business without being constantly tripped up or threatened with being tripped up by outside forces saying you're not doing the right thing, you've done the wrong thing? What sort of approach do you think we should adopt?
Well, I think the thing is that, and it's a point I make in the chapter, is that we have a seriously over-engineered system. So we have the National Employment Standards, we have the award system, and then we have the scope to make enterprise agreements, but from the award base. Now, what I'm proposing here, which may sound a little counterintuitive, is that, and I'm not sure the message that we need to reduce this over-engineering would play well. But what might play well is that I'd be inclined to boost the National Employment Standards and to shrink the award system and to facilitate the movement to enterprise agreements, both in union and non-union setting. And so I think there are definitely ways around it. And I mean, one option would be actually to create a small business award, okay, a fairly sort of scun-down statement of minimum conditions and pay and the like, and to allow that to be the base for small businesses to create agreements. And so I think there are ways around it, but I feel that at a broad level, the Liberal Party has to strongly think that this is a good area to capture electoral appeal, and I really think it does. I mean, if you think of some of the suburban, outer suburban regional areas, where is all the employment, absent some sort of patchy, large-scale employers? They're with small employers. Small business is basically the backbone of those areas, and therefore I think there's, and it's not just the owners that one can capture, it's also the people the families and the people who work for these small businesses.
Yeah. And I think we saw where after the Reith reforms in the early period of the first term of the Howard government, the AWAs were very quickly embraced across a wide range of sectors and a wide range of businesses, from the big businesses through to much smaller businesses. We had ended up with millions and millions of people under AWAs. So surely bringing something back like that, rather than relying on a top-down system or more of a bottom-up system, has got to be part of the future, don't you think?
Yeah, look, I think that it's a kind of an assumption that you work with. And I mean, the assumption that I would work with is that by and large, business owners and their workers can work out these things to their mutual benefit. And you don't need any imposition of external conditions and external regulation. But what's now happened, I think, for a lot of businesses is that they're very fearful of, moving out of the lane, so to speak, because, it really only has to be one complaint or one sort of bureaucrat sticking their nose into it and you're in trouble. So I think that's a great pity. I mean, it's interesting that I think one of the ways labour markets will adjust one way or another. And of course, one way it adjusts is that through independent contracting, people become their own bosses and they use commercial contracts and not the industrial relations laws to regulate how they work. And, if that were to be allowed, I can see that working very well too.
So a more favourable environment to encourage and facilitate more individual contracts, not in the IR system, but outside the industrial. So the subcontractor type arrangements, self-employment arrangements, which we know Tony Burke and the Labor Party at the moment are hell-bent on trying to attack many of those as well, as they call them employee type arrangements, and want to bring them under the control of the unions, which we know in some sectors, particularly the building industry, would be a classic. Well, of course, the construction unions are very keen to get their hands on all of those subcontractors in the residential area, which I would have thought the only outcome of which is going to be housing is going to become even more expensive to build and more unaffordable for Australians if they do that.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's very important. I think the independent contractors can be a very powerful force for the coalition, actually, because there are about 1 million of them. And the truth is they don't want to be dragged into the industrial relations system. This was something that Peter Costello did very well, which was to establish the BAS, the Business Activity Statement. So the sort of tax side of independent contracting was sorted through that. It's actually relatively low transaction costs. And then through a series of decisions, including the High Court, we have basically got to the point of establishing sanctity of contract for those independent contractors. The trouble is, as you say, the Labor Party are not keen on that. And you see, they regard the only legitimate form of employment is permanent employee by principal employer. So they don't like labour hire, they don't like casual, they don't like independent contracting. And the fear at the moment is that they will bring down laws which will be very hostile to those what they regard as non-legitimate forms of employment. This is going to be an opportunity for the coalition, because the truth is those other forms of employment suit both employers and the workers. They like the flexibility.
Absolutely.
So,
yes.
yeah. And I mean, you're right about, residential construction. At the moment, the subbies in residential construction are by and large independent contractors and not unionised, right? And I think the CFMEU do want to get into that area. I don't know whether it's going to work, but I had heard it, so there's this discussion about construction of new social housing. Well, a Labor government will involve the CFMEU in the construction of new social housing, and it's basically 25% at least.
At least.
More
I heard
expen-
in some cases it's 50%
Yes.
to 100% more
More
expensive for a
expensive
two-bedroom
than
unit. You
the
could build
building-
a whole house
Exactly.
if you're doing it privately.
Exactly,
So,
yeah.
yeah, so that's very true. The other factor that we see is participation. So not only do we have a productivity challenge, I think we have a potential participation challenge. And we've seen through various interactions, if you might say, of the tax and the welfare system, but also I think other rules, i.e. the lack of flexibility to give people, for instance, say older people or younger people, so both ends of the spectrum, the ability when they're studying to say, look, I only want to work 10 hours a week. Or if you're a retiree, you say, no, I still want to work part-time. And for instance, on the Gold Coast, I find that many of the Uber drivers are, for instance, retirees. And they love the ability. They just choose when they work, for how long they work, and they're not subject to any impressive workplace arrangement that says you must do this many hours and this much and so on. So I wonder if you have any thoughts as to what we can do to facilitate greater participation at both ends, from both young people and from older people in the workforce. And the reason I ask that is because I'm going to follow up and talk about immigration, which seems to be now the way everybody's hoping to sort of artificially boost the economy. But before we discuss immigration, perhaps we should talk about how we could maximise Australians, current Australians who are living here, their participation in the workforce. And if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, it's often called the gig economy, but increasingly called platform workers, and I think that's right. So Uber Eats, Airtasker, there are a whole range of them, and they provide very flexible arrangements for the workers. The Labor Party don't really like the gig economy, by the way, but as you say, people are basically showing their preference for it by their participation. I think there's a really useful, and I think the Liberal Party are a little bit onto this, about older worker participation. I mean, I think of my grandparents at like my age, they were old. I mean, they were always old, actually, as far as I can recall. Whereas, like, I think of people my age in their late 60s, we don't regard ourselves as old, and we regard ourselves as having many years of workforce participation left in us. Now, the trouble is that the rules in respect of the age pension are pretty hostile to people doing additional paid work and then being penalised in terms of lower age pension payments, but also potentially the benefits associated with the age pension. So I think that this is a very fruitful policy area. They have eased it up a little bit, but I can't really see the downside in allowing older workers to participate more. They were always entitled to the age pension when they went on it, and basically they will pay, taxation on their earnings. So I think if I were the Liberal Party, I would be pushing that as a preferred policy area quite strongly.
So Peter Dutton's initial gambit in that space, I think, was to double the earnings-free amount before you start losing your pension, which I think would be a sensible move, and maybe further things along that line.
But as you say, it's flexible for older people. If the grandchildren are around, they don't have to do it. If they've got free time, they do it. And so, I think there doesn't seem to be much downside to it.
Yeah, to your point about people working for longer and the choice. I ran into one of my colleagues who's a bit old, about almost a decade older than I am, as a partner in a Big Four firm, and they retire people at 58. And he was told he had to retire at 58. And I said, but you're still very young. What are you doing? And he said, well, I've joined a football club board and I'm looking for boards. But, nowadays with all the risks of joining public company boards in particular, you've got to be very careful that your assets are not at risk and the like. So it seems to me that there is a huge opportunity, to your point, to encourage people to work even well into their 70s. As we know, there are many people who are very active in their 70s, not including the US president who's in his 80s now, but that might be going too far. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to encourage existing trends. Which brings me to my last question, and that is mass immigration. And I think we should call it that. It's mass. When we're talking about 500,000 people in a 12-month period coming to Australia at the moment, without any attempt to deal with other avenues to increase productivity from the existing workforce, increase participation from those who aren't in the existing workforce, but just have this mass number of people coming, and at a time, as we know, when we've got issues around housing, energy, etc. And I just wonder your thoughts. What do you think is the driver behind this immediate move to mass immigration to pretend to boost the Australian economy?
Well, to be completely cynical, of course, is that the way the arithmetic works is that if you have strong immigration, it leads to strong population growth, and therefore absolute GDP will continue to grow. So the likelihood of having what economists normally define as a technical recession, the chances are reduced. Interestingly enough, in the national accounts, recent national accounts, per capita GDP actually declined,
yes.
Right? But at the moment, the focus is on absolute GDP. I think this is another area that the Liberal Party really needs to consider. I think if you look at survey after survey, people are concerned with mass immigration. They're okay with a measured migrant intake, but the kind of numbers. So this year we're likely to have 400,000 net migrant arrivals, which is just extraordinary. And as you say, in the context of a tight rental market and tight housing situation, it rather beggars belief. The thing is that the Labor government have some weird narrative that, COVID stopped migrant arrivals, so we have to sort of make it up. So I thought I had quite a good line on this, which was it's a bit like saying that there are roadworks and it's now okay to exceed the speed limit. No, it's not, as a matter of fact.
No.
we've always known that there are limits on the ability of an economy to absorb new arrivals, and we're clearly exceeding that. It's a very big issue in a lot of developed economies, the UK in particular, and also the US, although in the US it's mainly about illegal migrants. But there are levers you can pull which I think people would support. For example, I think in the UK, international students can no longer bring their families unless they're doing a PhD. That really restricts the number quite significantly. Specify a relatively high salary for temporary workers. That also restricts the numbers. Because the truth is we don't really want to create what you might call a sort of cohort of guest workers. You know, that's not a good idea, and that's what tends to happen. So I think that this is a fruitful area for the Liberal Party to think about. How can they create lower migrant intakes while still having a sensible and measured immigration policy?
And is there any final advice you'd like to offer the Liberal Party as it seeks to rebuild and rejuvenate to go forward, as some areas that you think they should focus on that you may not have mentioned already?
Well, of course, you know, I think I think COVID was very unfortunate in many ways. In the sense of government reactions was to create this huge step up in government spending. So the size of government has really increased very markedly, and there's very little indication that it's shrinking away. And so I would like the Liberal Party to recapture what I would call, I guess in shorthand way, the debt and deficit debate. I think that went...
Rod Kemp's written a very good chapter on that.
Oh,
yes,
good.
yeah.
I think that went away. I think people thought, oh, money's free, you know, we want more spending on all these things. What I think the government, the Liberal Party has to do, and it can compare itself with the government on this point, is to make the case for targeted, restrained spending, and to tell people, which is absolutely the truth, that government debt does matter a great deal. And there's actually a degree of illegitimacy in basically imposing these debt burdens on future generations. So I'd really like them to start thinking about how they can construct some political arguments about that issue.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time,
It's a pleasure,
Judith. Thank
David.
you for your contribution to the book, and I look forward to continuing to read your columns every week to keep the government and the opposition parties, for that matter, on the straight and narrow. Thank you again.